2,509. That is the number of libraries one man built across the world in a little under 40 years. Not funded quietly from a distance. Built, designed to a formula. Raised in nearly every town that agreed to his terms, from small railway stops in Iowa to the great cities of Britain and New Zealand. Andrew Carnegie, a Scottish immigrant who arrived in America with almost nothing, put his name on more public buildings than any monarch, any church, or any government of his age. And for over a century we have been told this was simple generosity. A poor boy who loved books, giving back. But here is the thing that does not sit right. A man does not spend the equivalent of billions building temples of stone in thousands of towns he will never visit without a reason. And when you look closely at what those buildings were, how they were designed, what they were allowed to contain, and what quietly disappeared in the process, a very different story starts to appear. This is not a story about a kind man and his books. This is a story about control. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. About memory, and about what a person with unlimited money makes certain the public is never allowed to see. To understand the libraries, you first have to understand the man, or at least the man we were handed. Andrew Carnegie was born in Dunfermline, Scotland, in 1835, in a weaver's cottage, into a family that was sliding into poverty as the machines took over the trade his father knew. In 1848, when Andrew was 12, the family sailed for America and settled near Pittsburgh. The official story is a straight line upward from there. He started as a bobbin boy in a cotton mill for a little over $1 a week. He became a telegraph messenger, then an operator, memorizing the sound of the wires. A railroad man named Thomas Scott took him on, and Carnegie learned how money really moved, not through labor but through position, through knowing things before other people knew them. There is a detail in that rise that the plaque never lingers on. Carnegie did not get rich by making things with his hands. He got rich by understanding systems, and by standing at the exact point where those systems could be controlled. As a young telegraph operator, he could read the messages passing over the wires before the businessmen they were addressed to. As a railroad man, he learned that the person who controls the flow of information and the flow of iron does not need to own the labor. He only needs to own the structure the labor moves through. Carnegie built bridges before he built steel mills, and a bridge is a fitting symbol for how his mind worked. He was never interested in the two banks. He was interested in the single narrow span that everything and everyone was forced to cross. Control the crossing, and you control the whole valley. He would apply that exact logic, later, to the memory of the world. He invested early in railroads, in bridges, in oil. Then he saw where the century was heading, and he bet everything on steel. By the turn of the century, Carnegie Steel produced more steel than all of Great Britain. In 1901, he sold the company to J.P. Morgan for around $480 million, a sum that made him the richest man in the world. That is the story on the plaque. An immigrant boy who outworked everyone. But money on that scale is never really about work, and what Carnegie did next has puzzled people for over 100 years, even if they were too polite to say it out loud. In 1889, he published an essay that would become his justification for everything that followed. He called it The Gospel of Wealth. In it, he argued that the man who dies rich dies disgraced. The wealthy, he wrote, were not owners of their fortune but trustees of it, obligated to return their surplus to society in their own lifetimes, and to do it in ways that improved the public rather than simply handing out charity. It sounds noble. It is quoted in business schools to this day. But read it again with a colder eye. Carnegie was not proposing to give money to people. He was proposing to decide personally what society needed. He would not raise wages. He would not hand his workers a share of the fortune they built with their hands. Instead, he would take the surplus, an amount larger than the budgets of most nations, and he would build things, institutions, structures that carried his name and his design and his rules. He would shape the public mind directly, in stone, and he would call it a gift. And the structure he chose, above all others, was the library. He could have built hospitals, he could have built schools, or houses, or handed cash directly to the poor whose labour had made him. He considered and rejected all of it. A hospital heals a body and asks nothing of the mind. A house shelters a family and shapes nothing beyond its walls. But a library is different. A library is where a society goes to learn what is true. It is where a child first meets the story of the world, and where an adult goes to confirm it or challenge it. To control the library is to stand at the source of the river, upstream of every belief a community will ever hold. Carnegie, the man who always found the single span everyone was forced to cross, understood that better than anyone alive. Of all the things unlimited money could buy, he chose to buy the place where knowledge itself was kept. The first one opened in 1,883 inches, Dunfermline, the town where he was born. Above the door he had them carve the words, "Let there be light." Then the program began to move, and once it moved with a speed that is genuinely hard to explain. Within a few decades, Carnegie libraries were rising in nearly every corner of the English-speaking world, more than 1,600 of them in the United States alone, hundreds more across Britain, Ireland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, even the Caribbean and Fiji, 2,509 buildings in total. Consider what that actually required. Not just money, though the money was staggering. It required plans, materials, stone, labour, and coordination across thousands of separate towns, many of them tiny, many of them remote, in an age before the highway and the airplane. It required a single vision imposed on an entire civilization's worth of communities at once. Slow down and picture the mechanics of it. In the year 1900, there were no bulldozers. There were no cranes as we know them. No ready-mixed concrete arriving by truck, no power tools humming on the site. Every one of these buildings had to be quarried, cut, hauled, and assembled largely by hand and by animal, in towns that in many cases had only just been connected to a rail line. And yet the buildings went up not over the span of a cathedral, which once took 100 years and 3 generations of masons, but in a season or two. Grand classical structures, coffered and columned and domed, appearing in remote settlements at a rate no cathedral builder in history could have matched, and appearing everywhere at once. Officially, this is simply what industrial wealth made possible. But if you have ever watched how long it takes to build even an ugly modern building today, with all our machines, the official answer should give you pause. And it worked because Carnegie did not simply hand the money over. He attached conditions, and it is in those conditions that the real machine begins to reveal itself. They called it the Carnegie formula, and it was less a gift than a contract. A town that wanted a library had to do 3 things. First, it had to prove there was demand, that the community actually wanted the building. Second, it had to provide the land, the site itself, at its own expense. And third, and this is the part people forget, the town had to pledge public tax money every single year, an amount equal to 10% of the original grant, to operate and maintain the library forever. Think about what that means. Carnegie did not just build a building and walk away. He bound the town to it. He reached into the future of that community and committed its taxpayers, generation after generation, to fund and preserve a structure he had designed on land they had surrendered under rules he had written. The building was a gift, the way a cuckoo's egg is a gift. Once it was in the nest, the town was obligated to keep it there. By the time the program ended, a huge share of the towns in the English-speaking world had accepted that arrangement. They had all agreed to the same terms. They had all built to the same standard. And that standardization was not an accident. It was the entire point. The man who enforced the standard was named James Bertram, Carnegie's private secretary, a quiet Scotsman who reviewed the plans for the buildings and held the power to approve or reject the money. Bertram was not an architect. He was an administrator, and around 1911 he produced a small pamphlet that tells you almost everything about what these buildings were really for. It was titled Notes on the Erection of Library Buildings. And yes, the word building is spelled there without its second I, buildings. Because Carnegie was a committed advocate of simplified spelling, a man who believed the very shape of written English should be reformed and standardized to his liking. Sit with that for a moment. Here was a private citizen who not only intended to rebuild the public architecture of the world, but who also wanted to re-engineer the spelling of the language read inside it. The pamphlet handed towns a set of schematic floor plans, 6 basic templates, marked with plain letters. Bertram discouraged ornament. He disliked grand entrance halls, sweeping staircases, tall interior columns, anything that wasted space, or, more importantly, anything that blocked sightlines. He wanted open interiors where a single librarian standing at a central desk could see the entire room at once. Every reader, every shelf, every door. A space designed, from the ground up, for total supervision. The rules went deeper than shape. Bertram pushed towns toward efficiency in everything. He wanted the entrance place so that a person walked in and stood at once under the eye of the desk. He wanted the book stacks open and low, sightlines unbroken, corners eliminated. He objected to money spent on beauty over supervision. Every deviation from his templates had to be argued for and approved by his office in New York before a single dollar was released. So, the small town in Indiana and the small town in New South Wales, 10,000 miles apart, with nothing in common, no shared history, no shared climate, no shared stone, ended up with sibling buildings. Not because those communities converged on the same idea, because a single office, run by a single man, quietly required it. This is what it looks like when one will is imposed on 1,000 places and dressed up as 1,000 separate gifts. Empires have always understood this. When Rome conquered a province, it did not merely garrison it, it built. It laid down the same roads, the same forums, the same temples, the same bathhouses, in the same style, from Britain to Syria, so that a citizen could travel 1,000 miles and step into a world that felt already familiar, already settled, already inevitable. Standardized architecture is how a single power tells 1,000 different peoples that there is now only one story and that they are all inside it. Carnegie, a private man with no crown and no army, did in 40 years across the entire English-speaking world what most empires never manage in centuries. He gave a fractured, various, unruly collection of towns one shared civic temple, one shared style, one shared idea of where knowledge lived and what it looked like. Whatever else that was, it was not charity, as we normally mean the word. The libraries were sold to the public as temples of free knowledge. But the men who designed them were obsessed, on paper, in writing, with oversight, with control, with making certain that inside these buildings everything could be seen and nothing could be hidden. Everything, that is, except the questions nobody was ever allowed to ask about the buildings themselves. Because here is where the official story starts to strain. Look at the Carnegie libraries that survive, and especially at the grand ones in the cities. Massive stone facades, Corinthian and Ionic columns, domes, coffered ceilings, symmetry so precise it feels less like architecture and more like ritual. These were called temples of knowledge, and the word temple was not a metaphor. They were raised in the classical style of ancient Greece and Rome, the architecture of empires that had supposedly crumbled to dust well over 1,000 years before. And they did not appear one at a time across centuries, the way old architecture is supposed to accumulate. They appeared almost all at once, thousands of them, across the entire globe, inside a single narrow window of about 40 years. The same columns in Pittsburgh and in small-town Kansas, the same domes in Scotland and in New Zealand, a worldwide wave of monumental, classical, master-crafted stone construction, cresting and then stopping, all within the span of one man's giving. Stand in front of one of the surviving grand ones today and ask yourself an honest question. Could we build that now? Not could we afford it. Could we actually do it, the hand-carved stone, the proportion, the ornament, the craft, in a random town of a few thousand people? The answer, if you are honest, is no. We do not build like that anymore. We are told, we simply choose not to. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. But there is a difference between choosing not to and no longer being able to. And a growing number of people, looking hard at these buildings, have begun to ask whether the story of who built them and when and how is really as simple as the plaque on the wall. Consider the ornament alone. On the finest of these buildings, the stone is not merely cut, it is carved deeply, with acanthus leaves and egg and dart mouldings and human faces and scroll work, the kind of work a master mason spends a lifetime learning, and that a town of 2,000 souls could not have produced from its own population. Where did the armies of master craftsmen come from, all at once, in the same few decades, on every inhabited continent, to execute the same vanished style at the same superhuman pace, and then vanish just as suddenly, taking the knowledge of how it was done away with them? We are asked to believe that this skill blossomed globally and simultaneously, flourished for a single lifetime, and then died out completely and forever, right at the moment the cameras and the paperwork could finally have documented it in full. It is not proof of anything, but it is a very strange shape for history to take. Some go much further. They point to the great expositions of the same era, the world's fairs, entire cities of colossal white classical palaces that were supposedly raised in a matter of months and then, almost unbelievably, demolished within a year or two. They point to the star-shaped fortifications, the ornate train stations, the domed courthouses, the grand hotels, all of it in the same style, all of it in the same window, much of it later torn down. And they ask a simple, uncomfortable question. What if these structures were not built by the men who took the credit? What if they were older than we are told? What if a man with unlimited money did not raise these places at all, but rather acquired them, renamed them, filled them with a curated version of history, and made every town that received one promise, in writing and in tax law, to maintain the story forever? There is a word that circulates for this idea, a reset. The notion that the world we think we know, the clean official timeline running smoothly from cave to cathedral to skyscraper, is hiding a seam, a place where one world was cleared away and another was written over the top of it, with the grand old buildings left standing because they were too solid or too useful to tear down all at once. In that telling, men like Carnegie are not the architects of the old world at all. They are the caretakers of the new one. The people handed the keys to what already stood, and handed the task of explaining it and funding its upkeep, and stocking its shelves with the single version of the past everyone was now meant to accept. Whether you find that idea absurd or unsettling, notice how neatly Carnegie's actual, documented behavior fits inside it. He did not invent the classical style. He inherited it, or built copies of it, filled the buildings, controlled them, and bound the future to maintain them. That much is not theory. That much is on the record. I am not going to tell you what to believe about the stones, but I will tell you this. Whether Carnegie raised these buildings or simply took the credit for them, one thing is beyond any dispute. He decided what went inside them. And a library is not its walls. A library is its shelves. A library is a claim about what is worth remembering and what is allowed to be forgotten. And this is where the phrase that should haunt every one of these buildings finally arrives. It is not what Carnegie built. It is what he made certain they would all leave out. Consider what a coordinated network of thousands of nearly identical libraries actually does to a society's memory. Before Carnegie, a town's knowledge was scattered and strange. Private collections, church records, local historical societies, oddities passed down through families, books printed by small regional presses that answered to no one. Memory was local, and local memory is difficult to manage because it is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. After Carnegie, knowledge had an address. It had a building, a standardized building, with a standardized cataloging system, stocked increasingly from a narrowing set of approved publishers, overseen by a librarian trained to a national standard, in a room designed so that everything could be watched. The public library became the single official container for what a community was permitted to know about itself and about the world. And once you have built the container, you no longer need to burn anything. You simply decide what is placed on the shelf and what is quietly never acquired at all, and within a generation, the things that were never acquired cease to exist in living memory. This is the quiet genius of the project, and it is far more effective than censorship. Censorship leaves a scar. People remember the banned book. They talk about it. They hunt for it. But curation leaves nothing behind. When a history is simply never collected, never shelved, never catalogued in the one official building where knowledge now lives, it does not get banned, it gets forgotten. And the town that lost it does not even know it is gone. It thanks the man on the plaque for the gift of light, never suspecting that the same light was carefully aimed to leave certain corners in permanent shadow. And think about who lost the most in that transaction. It was always the local, the regional, the odd, the self-published account of a town's founding that contradicted the tidy version. The pamphlet from a press that printed 200 copies and then closed its doors forever. The family record, the immigrant's memoir, in a language the new librarian could not read, the crank, the eccentric, the eyewitness. None of it was destroyed. It simply was not invited onto the shelf. And a book that is not on the shelf of the only library in town, in a world that has just been taught that the library is where truth lives, might as well not exist. Within 2 generations it is not even a rumour. The grandchildren of the people who wrote it walk past the building every day and feel only gratitude for the light. What histories were those? What did the older, stranger, more local records say about where these towns came from, about who really built the grand structures that predated the modern age, about the world as it was before a single narrow story became the only one available on the shelf? We cannot fully know. That is precisely the point. The alternative was not preserved in the one place a society preserves things, and the man who owned that place made certain of it. And if you want proof that Carnegie understood exactly how to erase an inconvenient history, you do not have to speculate about ancient stone. You only have to look at what he erased about himself. In the summer of 1892, at Carnegie's own steelworks in Homestead, Pennsylvania, the workers who made his fortune went on strike. They were fighting wage cuts handed down in the middle of record profits. Carnegie left the country. He sailed for his castle in Scotland and left his manager, Henry Clay Frick, to deal with it. Frick locked the workers out, built a fence topped with barbed wire around the plant, and hired an army of Pinkerton agents to break the strike by force. What followed was a battle. The Pinkertons came up the river on barges in the dark. The workers and their families were waiting on the bank. Men died on both sides that day, in the town where Carnegie's steel was made. The state sent in thousands of militia. The Union was crushed, and the men who had built the empire went back to work, beaten for less. Carnegie was thousands of miles away, writing letters, keeping his own hands clean, letting another man hold the gun. And then, over the years that followed, he did something remarkable. He rebuilt his own image, one library at a time, until the blood at Homestead faded from public memory, and the only word left attached to his name was philanthropist. He gave the world thousands of temples of knowledge, and inside not one of them, on any official shelf, was the true story of the men who died so that he could afford to build them. He edited himself out of his own crime. And it worked so completely that most people who use his libraries today have never heard the name Homestead at all. And here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. It was not a cover-up in the crude sense. There was no order to hide the truth, no shredded documents, no men in the night. The truth of Homestead was public. It was in the newspapers of the day. Anyone could have known it. Carnegie did not bury the fact. He simply built something so large, so bright, so relentlessly repeated in every town in the country that the fact could no longer compete for space in the public mind. He did not erase the memory. He crowded it out, with 2,509 monuments to a kinder story, each one carved in stone and paid for, forever, by the very public it was quietly reshaping. That is not censorship. It is something newer and far more powerful. It is the manufacture of memory at industrial scale, by the same man, with the same instincts, that had made the steel. A man who can do that to his own history can do it to anyone's. There is one more piece, and it is the strangest of all. Of the 2,509 libraries Carnegie built, a great many no longer stand. Over the decades, city after city quietly demolished its Carnegie Library. Some were replaced with modern boxes of glass and concrete. Some were torn down for parking. The grand stone temples, the ones we supposedly cannot build anymore, were knocked flat and hauled away. often with little protest and even less ceremony. Ask why, and you will be told they were outdated, too small, too costly to heat, not accessible, all of it reasonable on the surface. But notice the pattern. The buildings that raised the most uncomfortable questions, the most monumental, the most impossible to explain as the simple charity of a self-made industrialist, were also the ones most likely to disappear. The evidence, if it was evidence, was cleared away, and a society that had been trained for a century to associate these buildings with one kind, book-loving old man, barely noticed them go. And here the two halves of this story, the provable and the speculative, finally touch. Because whichever version you believe, the demolitions serve the same end. If Carnegie merely built copies of an old style, then tearing them down erases the physical evidence of a coordinated global project run by a single private man, and leaves only the sanitized survivors behind glass. And if he did something stranger, if these buildings were older than the record admits, then tearing them down erases the evidence of that too. Either way, the objects that could be measured, dated, questioned, and compared were quietly reduced in number, decade after decade, until only a curated handful remained, each one now safely wrapped in the official story. The container was standardized, the contents were curated, and then most of the containers themselves were taken away. What is left is exactly what a careful hand would choose to leave. Enough to admire, never quite enough to investigate. What remains is a scattering, a few hundred grand survivors, protected now, photographed, admired, safely explained. Thousands of others reduced to a cornerstone set into a newer wall, a name on an old photograph, a memory growing fainter every year. The container outlived the contents, and the contents, whatever they truly were, are almost gone. So let us return to the number we started with, 2,509. We were taught to see it as a monument to generosity, the largest act of book-loving kindness in the history of the world. Numbers like that are meant to end the conversation, not to begin it. We hear 2,509 and we picture a saint. But a saint does not write contracts. A saint does not standardize floor plans, or bind towns to a century of tax payments, or design a room so that a single watcher can see every reader inside it at a glance. Those are the acts of an engineer. And Carnegie was, before and above everything else, an engineer of systems, a man who had spent his whole life learning that the way to move a world is not to argue with it, but to build the one structure it is forced to move through, and then to quietly own that structure. But look at what that number actually describes. A single private individual, richer than most governments, reshaping the public architecture of the entire English-speaking world in his own preferred style inside one lifetime, binding thousands of towns by contract to maintain his buildings and his story forever. Standardizing not only the architecture but the very shelves, deciding in advance what an entire civilization would be permitted to remember and what it would quietly lose, designing every interior for total supervision, and proving, with his own carefully rewritten life, that he understood exactly how to make an inconvenient history vanish without leaving a mark. Maybe it was all sincere. Maybe a poor boy who loved books simply wanted to share that love with the world, and the control, the conditions, the standardization, the strange architecture, the vanished records, and the buried crime were all just coincidence. Or maybe the most effective way to control what a people remembers is not to burn their books in the square where everyone can see the flames. It is to build them a beautiful temple, carve "Let there be light" above the door, hand them the key, and quietly decide, forever, which books are ever allowed inside. Carnegie built 2,509 libraries in 40 years. The real question was never what he put in them. It is what he made certain you would never find on the shelf. And whether, standing in the pale grand hush of one of the survivors today, you are looking at a gift, or at the most elegant act of forgetting ever built in stone.